Hello, everyone, and welcome back. As this is the third episode, as it's about time that I gave a name to this show, and the name that I've settled on is in lay terms, because the whole purpose of this show is to take the complicated issues and the esoteric language that these experts use to tell us that we're not smart enough to fix our own problems and we have to rely on government. So what I'm trying to do is simplify it into lay terms. Today, our guest is a good friend of mine, Corinne Maury. She's a terminated nurse, and recently she's been investigating the unions. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Corinne, and I'll let you go on and introduce yourself a little bit more.
Thanks, Heyman. Yes, I'm Corinne Maury. I'm currently living in Nelson, BC, and I embarked on a journey that I wasn't expecting to navigate, but here we are. So I come from an actual self-employed background. I did my nursing when I was 50, so I graduated in 2015, and then I worked for Interior Health until 2022 when I was terminated. I was a nurse that was working in all different areas, emergency room, medical units, COVID units, and worked all during the pandemic. And it was only when nurses started getting terminated that there was signals twitching on my antennas that, oh, there's something wrong here, and I don't really know what it is. I have never been really involved in any kind of political discussions. I was, as most of the public is, I was just trying to earn a living, trying to raise my family, and trying to be a responsible citizen, not really comprehending all the levels of influence that impact how we are surviving in this province. So that started the journey for me, the termination. And the first thing that I ended up encountering was the union. Now, when I got hired with Interior Health, it is mandatory that you also sign on the dotted line to become a union member. And I really honestly didn't know what that meant, except that apparently union members can strike at some point. And that was all I really understood. Once this process began with the terminations of healthcare in BC, I had to get educated really quickly. And so the things that I'll communicate today are just my experience. I'm not an expert. I am not a certified accountant. I am not a legal person, but I have interacted with those professions to gain an understanding of what happened. So the first thing that I started to understand is that unions are made up of members. And let's use an example of, say, you buy a membership at a golf course. That entitles you to use the services of the golf course, and there's special privileges that are attached to that membership. It's the same with unions. Unions are structured under this membership entity. And in my case, so I'm going to talk more about the BC Nurses Union because that's my experience specifically, but I have also been in contact with workers and professionals from other unions, and there were similar things that occurred during the last couple of years that I encountered with my union. So the BC Nurses Union, I believe, has, I think, close to 49,000 members. If you work in the public sector, you are required to become a union member. And I discovered in many other unions, it is mandatory. Now, this is one thing I didn't understand. Canada is one of the only countries that compels people to become members. Other countries, you can choose if you want to become a member. This one, you cannot choose. If you want that job, you have to become a member. So you are compelled to join the union. Now, the whole purpose of the union, if you look in their mission statements, mine says it's to protect the socioeconomic well-being of its members. So that was interesting because if that is the mission statement of the union, When thousands of nurses started getting terminated and refused the ability to work in our province, you would have thought that the union's response would be to protect its members. It didn't. So then we move into, okay, well, this is interesting because it was only in 2019 that our union met with the Ministry of Health, including Bonnie Henry, and HEA BC, which is the Health Employers Association of BC. They're the entity that sort of governs all of the human resource stuff that goes on with all the health authorities. So the entity overseeing the health authorities is HEA BC. The entity overseeing the nurses union is actually called the Nurses Bargaining Association, which covers two unions, BCNU and the Health Sciences Association. NBA and HEABC and the Ministry of Health all decided, after multiple years of investigation and riding on similar arbitration decisions out of Ontario, the nurses union there, that when it came to the flu policy, where nurses were required to get the flu vaccination or wear a mask for the duration of the flu season, it was found to be discriminatory, as there was no evidence that flu vaccinations actually helped, or the masks did not actually help. So as a result, in 2019, there was an amended flu policy with those three entities that brought out the decision that no nurse would ever be disciplined again for not getting a vaccination or not wearing a mask during that season. That was just 2019. So then when the mandates came down in 2021, it was like, well, obviously we just have this recent decision. This is a policy. This is something that everybody has agreed to abide by. And all of a sudden it wasn't. So we were trying to, in the moment, trying to figure out, okay, what's going on? How are they going to step in? In our case, we discovered that from September of 21 to December of 21, when all the terminations were happening, in our union, the president resigned, the CEO resigned. Everybody was taking leaves of absence, and the only person that was actually working was the treasurer. But we didn't find that out until months later, and we couldn't figure out why there was no response from our union. Well, it's just they all decided not to go to work. We also ended up with an issue that there is two levels of interaction that occur in leadership in a union. You have your elected representatives, so your president, your vice president, your treasurer, but then you also have the hired staff of the union, in which case it's the chief executive officer, chief operations officer. These are now hired staff that are not elected, that take on positions of authority. In our case, we had some interesting developments. So the CEO that had been hired took a leave in December, and he was replaced with another lawyer named Jim Gould, who was a partner in the firm of HHBG. Now, interestingly, HHBG was retained by the union for legal representation. So we had an issue, and we actually put in a complaint to the BC Law Society that this was a conflict of interest, that the CEO of this union would financially benefit because he was a partner in the firm that was retained by the union. And we were told that, well, because we weren't actually a client of Jim Gould, we couldn't put in this complaint. And so they didn't follow up with it. So as time progressed, there were other things that we started to understand. Unions in BC, so unions are all governed by their provincial jurisdiction. And there are some interesting facts about unions. Here they are under a nonprofit umbrella. And so they don't have to declare or pay any kind of tax. Now, to maintain that status, they have to make sure that they don't show any kind of profit. And again, they have to protect their members. So in our case, the members were not protected. And in the second issue, not showing a profit, well, we had some questions about that. So the policy of the union is that there's one particular fund called a defense fund, which is supposed to be used to help pay nurses' wages during any strike event. Now, the last time the union participated in any kind of strike was, I think, around 2006. So we're coming on 18 years since any kind of strike action happened. And it's part of the policy of the union that they have to have $25 million in that account to help cover costs for nurses if there's a strike. That fund currently has $70 million in it. And this last year was a year where there was bargaining going on. And I'll explain more about what that is. But there was a lot of pressure from the union that nurses should not strike because we would be viewed as being greedy. So there's a lot of pressure from the union to not strike. At the same time, they're accumulating this amount of money in a fund that they refuse to use to actually defend terminated nurses. So now we question the whole thing of a profit. So we have the foundational core meaning of what a union is, which is to gather workers together to protect their working conditions, to make sure that there's a safe workplace, to make sure that workers get fair wages. And instead, I am seeing that this union, which is now, I think, almost 250 employees, has become another version of the royal family. They are experiencing really great wages and benefits, and yet we are not actually allowed to see what anyone is doing in terms of operations and the ability for us to access the actual financial transactions. They refuse to provide except on financial statements that are provided to us, but they're very vague. Unions have a very low requirement for disclosure on their financial transactions. They can lump all sorts of expenses together. And as well, they don't have to differentiate between what's called representation expenses and non representation expenses. Now, in the States, those have to be divided. So I'll give you an example. Representation would be the main process that workers have when they have a dispute with the employer is, oh, and one point I'll also bring up is that when you sign on to be a union member, you legally transfer all legal representation for any workplace issue to the union. You as an individual can no
Wow.
longer access your own representation. So now that transfers to the union. The union itself will spend money on all sorts of things. And some of it will be representation, which is where they're actually hiring lawyers to help you with a grievance, or they have staff, labor relations officers that are trying to defend you. But then there's also things called non-representation, and political contributions would fit into that category. Now, interestingly enough, I was on the BC Elections website the other day to look at, because it's posted all the contributions that have gone to political parties over the last 15 or so years for sure. So I noticed that BCNU hadn't really given a ton. They had given some to the BC NDP party, but the Health Sciences Association, which is the other union, had contributed almost $100,000 to the BC NDP party. So there are other unions that, for instance, BCGEU, I stopped counting at 1.5 million. QP, I stopped counting at 500,000. So these union, and they're all paying money to the BC NDP party. So you as a member, regardless of what your political leanings are, your money is going to support a certain political party, which you may have an issue with. And it may not be what you want to put your money towards, but it's their decision. Our union members are required to pay 2% of their earnings. We also have an issue where 1% of our earnings is also paid into a fund called a retiree benefits fund, which is currently, I believe, over $450 million. Interestingly enough, the only payment that retired workers have gotten is a one-time $500 payment, and we cannot locate where the rest of this money is. We've been asking for disclosure of it, and it's just not forthcoming. Did you want to jump in here? Because I could just rattle on forever.
I have so many questions. So sorry, you're doing a great job. The 75 million used to be 20 million. Now it's 75 million. Where does that money come from?
It comes from our dues. Well, no, I'm okay. This is another interesting component. Annual dues that the union collects from nurses are about $60 million. This year, the BC government, through the Ministry of Health, made a payment of $100 million to this union last spring. Now, I was trying to understand why the government is giving money to a union, especially when the union's job is to be holding the government accountable. How does this not compromise union members if the union takes more money from the government than it takes from its own members? So we have union member dues that are income, but we're also somehow taking money from taxpayers in this province to the union. So this defense fund, which the policy is to keep 25 million in it, it has increased over the last few years to 70 million. We don't know what the source of this money is, but we do know it is not being used for nurses. So the disclosure on what is going on is very difficult. And in fact, I had actually talked to CRA about trying to find a way to be able to examine all the financial transactions that are going on in this union. And I was told actually today that the only way I can access that is if I have permission from the union. So even though we as citizens should have rights to information through freedom of information, and especially now that it's taxpayer money that is being given to these entities, we have no way to actually access what's going on with that money. And I was just actually downloading off of the union website. Interestingly enough, there is a memorandum of understanding that occurred between the Nurses Bargaining Association, which is the entity that covers the two nursing unions, and the Ministry of Health. And they have come up with a plan that this year they gave 100 million to the union. In 2023-24, they're going to up that to 200 million. 24-25, it's going to be 250 million. And after that, ongoing $300 million. Again, taxpayer money to a union. Now, they say that it's because they're going to provide more mental health supports for nurses, which nurses have not accessed. And that is actually something that does not have to be provided through the union. They can add benefits on through their medical plans. And also, they want to put money into retention, which is interesting because they're doing nothing to represent terminated nurses. And then the other thing is, this was super interesting, was the bringing in of more foreign nurses, immigration. So it's very ambiguous how this money is actually distributed. Oh, and the last thing was this nurse patient ratio that they want to legislate. So the government, I don't know if you caught, but a couple of weeks ago, there was this big photo op with the BC NDP government and the BC Nurses Union in a fancy hotel. And they were going, we're going to mandate nurse patient ratios because we have to ensure safety for patients. So, for instance, if you're a really acute patient, we're going to have one-on-one nursing. So one nurse per one patient. And then depending how acute things are, we're going to enforce that nurses only have a certain amount of patients per role. They say that they're going to mandate that. They've put, looks like $60 million just towards this issue. During the same week, I had nurses contact me about the actual working conditions. So one nurse told me at the Royal Jubilee Hospital, which is in Victoria, just a couple kilometers away from legislature, that she had just done 30 shifts in a row. Now, when I was working 2 years ago, you had to get permission to do 6 shifts in a row because of the fatigue policy. Now, this was to ensure that nurses didn't get over fatigued, because then you have safety concerns for both the nurse and the patient. And so this was enforced. Now it's not. And I said to the nurse, I'm very concerned about this decision you're making. It's not wise. You're going to burn out. And she said to me, at the Royal Jubilee Hospital, in those units that are supposed to have 4 and 5 nurses, there's one showing up for work. And so nurses are being pushed to the max to show up because we don't want people to die. So this is going on at the same time that your government is giving you optics that they are going to ensure safe patient ratios. And so the only way that I could see that actually happening is if you make sure that half of the population does not have access to healthcare, because there's no other way that they could actually manage those kinds of ratios. Okay. Did you want to jump in with the question here?
Yeah, let's I'm trying to simplify this. So somebody told me, true or false, the unions don't collect the dues. The government collects it and gives it to the union.
Correct. So
Okay.
they are subject to the employers collecting the dues. So it comes directly off your paycheck. When you receive your paycheck, that's already been taken off. Where, at least if it was that the nurse themselves had to make the payment, then it gives a little bit more control for accountability. But when you receive your paycheck, that is already taken off and provided to the union, and the unions are subject to the employers paying that.
Okay. Try to follow me. So the government, thank you by that, by the way, that's helpful. The government takes the money from the nurses, gives it to the unions. $60 million, I think that's the figure you used.
Yep.
So 60 million government gives to the unions. And then you mentioned another 100 million last year or something.
This year in March.
And then it's going to scale up until eventually it gets to 250 million.
Up to
So
350. Yeah. Or 300.
So I'm not going to hide the fact that I hate governments. I think they're useless. So you have a government coming in, taxing the citizens 100 million, giving it to the unions, and they're taxing citizen nurses 60 million on top of that and giving it to the unions. Is that somewhat accurate?
The 60 million would not be considered a tax. It would be called a membership fee. So again, comparing to a golf course, if you want to be a member of a golf course, you have to pay a fee to have that right to use their services. So it's the same with a union. You have to pay a fee to retain membership. But the issue in Canada is that is coerced. It's compelled. Every other country, it's a choice if you want to be part of the union. It's voluntary, which means right away you have a layer of accountability and process that the union will have to make sure it's doing its job. Otherwise, nobody will sign up to be a member of its services, right? But in this country, you're forced. So there is no motivation to actually do a good job because their income is guaranteed no matter what level of service they provide.
Okay, let's touch on something else you mentioned. You said that you have the elected people, president, vice president, and then you have the bureaucracy, the employees, CEO. I think you mentioned.
Yeah.
I look at West Vancouver, which is my riding, my area. You have elected officials, the mayor and the council, and then you have this prince that calls himself the chief administrative officer that makes a huge amount of money, 275,000. Is there any parallels between this permanent bureaucracy running roughshod in government and in unions?
Well, interestingly enough, in this memorandum of understanding that is this agreement where the provincial government is going to be giving all sorts of money to this union, it is signed off by the CEO. It's not by the elected officials. Now, I've been doing a lot of work with local government in the regional district. So at a local level, regional district also operates, and all municipalities are under the regional district as well. So you'll have your cities, towns, and all your areas are under the umbrella of local government regional district. Regional district also has an elected board of directors, and they also have hired staff. Now, the proper hierarchy of power, because regional districts swear an oath of allegiance to the residents, is that the public gives input to the board of directors, who then vote and then give instructions to the staff on how to carry out the decisions that have been made. In our case, what we've been recognizing is because the public has not really been participating in government actions, politics, because it's been increasingly complex and difficult to access what's going on. In our case, our board of directors don't even record their votes. There's no recording of the meetings, and so the public has no way to know what's going on in that building. So, but what we have now is we've noticed the staff are making recommendations to the board, who then vote on things that help out the staff, but it's at the detriment of the public. And so we have had increased numbers of hiring. Our local government, the taxation in just 5 years went from 26 million to 36 million. That's what they have received in revenue from property taxes. And yet our taxes still went up between 6 and 10%, depending where you lived, and they've increased the user fees. So it seems it doesn't matter how much money they collect, it's never enough. They expand the royal family concept, where that group of people is benefiting while your citizens are paying increased costs to live in their communities.
So what's going on here? Is this vote harvesting where the government gives them $100 million to the unions to secure the votes of the nurses, and then the people with property are just only 49%?
That's an interesting path you're taking, because we are just starting to look at, if you go onto the BC Elections website, they actually post all the political contributions to all the different parties. I would say 95% of all those contributions are to the BC NDP party. There are rules around limits that can be provided. And it looks like in some cases, those rules are just being ignored. It's an interesting path where there's, to me, this uneasy relationship that's occurring between unions and the government. And it became very obvious during the pandemic, when there was hundreds of thousands of employees that were forced into unpaid leaves, not just healthcare. We're talking corrections officers, public service. There was hundreds of thousands of people where the government took away their ability to work. This was the first time in our history that this has ever happened, and it was interesting that somehow this was normalized to occur. So now we have the government making these decisions, and the only buffer that we have for protection legally is through the union, and the union wouldn't do it. Now, in this province, I don't know what the influence was, but every other worker in BC has been returned to their job except for healthcare. I don't know why our union in particular is holding out. Like, they won't even talk about us. And we had to put in complaints to the labor board. So when it comes to court and legal action against a union, there's only one route that you can take, and that's through the BC Labor Board. There's rules around accessing that process. When it comes to unionized workers, the process for getting resolution, if there's any challenges between the worker and the employer, is through the grievance process. There are 3 steps to that process. The first 2 include having meetings with the employer, and you try to resolve this. If you cannot do that, it has to go to step 3, where some level of arbitration is involved. So another party makes the decision. So the process with the labor board is that you have to go all the way through that grievance process. Then you have to appeal that decision. And if you still don't have a resolution, then you can put in a complaint to the labor board. In our case, our union deliberately stalled our representation between step 2 and step 3. So we could not complete that process. We had no control over that. We went ahead and submitted Section 12 complaints, which is a failure of duty to obtain fair representation from your union. The BC Labor Board they have 180 days to come to a decision. They gave themselves an extension. Then they came back and said that they were dismissing our complaints, not because of the evidence that we submitted, but because we hadn't followed the process, which was we have to get a decision and have an appeal, which we couldn't do. They invited us to resubmit our complaints, which we will, but somehow during that process, the union then decided to go ahead and pursue arbitration for us, which is going to occur in March of 2024. They have the ability to choose what arbitrator they want, and they have chosen a good one, Jackie DeGuayo, who has a strong reputation. But what we've discovered is that the legal firm that is in charge of our representation is actually doing nothing to create a strong case. And for us, we actually had the free offer of Dr. Stephen Pellick, who is head of a medical department at UBC, who has been doing all sorts of research on the vaccination and antibody response and has all the latest data. He offered his services to our union for free as an expert witness, because he's also provided that service to other unions and successfully was able to ensure that they weren't mandated. They refused to contact him. So we know that the representation that we're going to get is going to be minimal. and we as members cannot enforce that they do a good job.
Let me reframe what you just said to me, and then I'm going to hit you with a big question. So the issue is that you have mandatory union membership. When you become a member, you forfeit your right to outside legal counsel. So you're dependent on the unions for your defense. You have a government that's attacking its employees. And then you have a union that refuses to defend you.
You got it.
Okay. So that's the problem. Why are they doing, like, why is in your opinion, why is the government attacking its own citizens, and why is the union going along with it?
From what I can see, and it's hard to get the whole picture, right? Like, we're getting pieces of things, and from an outsider, just an average person who is working with a team of average people, we are just digging in and researching documents and researching the law. And we as just average people are trying to put the dots together. Now, Last November, the BC NDP party pushed through another act called the Health Professions Act. So now what they've done is effectively removed all elected representation of healthcare professionals. So to help everyone understand, every profession is governed by a college. So in my case, it's the BC College of Nurses and Midwives. You have the College of Physicians. You have the College for Dentists. So every profession has their own elected representation to assist with what their standards of practice are, what their ethical conduct should be like. And so the BC NDP government has now put through an act where they are removing all the elected representation. They are amalgamating colleges together, and they're going to appoint their own government officials to start running the professional standards of these professionals, which in many cases, they don't even have to have somebody from that profession in that role. So we have now political interference in the healthcare professions. And for those who aren't aware of it, there is significant increased penalties if you don't comply with what the government tells you. They've now instituted massive fines of hundreds of thousands of dollars and jail time if you don't cooperate. This whole vaccination thing was not actually something that Bonnie Henry specified in her orders. She just said that healthcare professionals couldn't work. It was the employer that actually enforced the terminations, which is totally illegal and totally against our not only just the Employment Standards Act, but our collective agreements that we negotiate as to the terms of the working agreement. It was the employers that decided to terminate. And this is what's happening right now in the courts right now with Bonnie Henry and doctors and the Justice Center that are actually bringing this legal action against these entities because Bonnie Henry operated in a way that she actually didn't have the authority to do. The repercussions were that the employers terminated, they weren't held to account, and now we have issues with when we actually are able to access legal protection, there's going to be significant payouts that the public has to incur for this discrimination against healthcare workers. So every time they I'm kind of wandering here, so this is going to have to be edited. Where were we going? Because I lost that track. It was important.
Uh, you know what? I got a WhatsApp call and I kind of lost our track too. We were,
Okay.
um, I don't know. I laid it. Oh, why is the government why
Oh,
is the government attacking its citizens and why are unions going along with it?
okay. So now, like with this Healthcare Professions Act, the government is now taking control of all of the professions associated with the healthcare system that we have. So now we are losing autonomy as healthcare professions to be able to, for doctors, they can't determine the medical interventions that a patient needs. This is now being determined by government. So it seems to me that there's this creep of the government trying to move into a place of authority over every segment of the social services that are to be provided in this province. Another example that I'll throw in here, which is not to do with unions, but it's currently in play right now, which is this Development Act that the provincial government is trying to push through. So they want to create a pathway where they can supersede the municipal authorities' decisions on local development. The government has decided that it has to bring in all of these increased foreign workers to meet the work demands, even though we have Canadian citizens who are refused the ability to work. they're bringing in all sorts of immigration policies to increase foreigners while they don't have the housing to provide for them to live, which has put increased stress on housing, which has now given the government the ability to say, oh, we're in a housing crisis. So we want to be able to mandate to local municipalities the development that has to occur in these communities. So they're putting in regulations around the size of the community, where it is in terms of a bus route, and they are trying to dictate to communities that you have to do multi-unit dwellings in a certain amount of space. And you can go above the amount, but as a developer, you can't go lower. So basically, they're trying to reduce single family dwellings. They're trying to make very condensed populations in small areas. And the issue with this is the provincial government, even though they are going to take the authority to dictate to a community what it has to develop, they are removing the local community's right to be able to have input. So they're going to remove the ability for public hearings. So this dictation will come from the provincial government, but they are not going to provide any of the costs provided in terms of the infrastructure development that has to occur to support this. So we're talking water, sewer, etc. In order to ensure those services, that will be downloaded on to current property owners through taxation. Now, this week, just last week, which was the last week of November in 2023, there was a news article about Osoyoos, and the public is protesting because their property taxes are going up 40% because of all the development that occurred in that community, and the infrastructure did not keep up with what was required for it. So the developers weren't forced to actually contribute to water sewer construction. It now is the responsibility of property owners. So it's quite interesting because this push of creating affordable housing is actually, the cost of it will be downloaded onto current property owners through taxation. So it's not just that there has been an imposition of the government into healthcare. Now we have the imposition of provincial government into local communities, dictating what their development is going to look like and downloading those costs onto you as an individual. And then we also have right now a push of the Emergency Act, which has given the government increased power again. They've enlarged the definition of an emergency to include pandemic and terrorism. And they have given themselves increased power in terms of seizing and entering assets and property without any kind of, what's that thing called? You have to have the
Rule of
official
law,
document.
warrant.
A warrant, yes. Without
Yeah.
any warrant, they can take use of water supplies. It's quite impressive the amount of authority that they are starting to legislate for themselves, which is going to not only take away your, as an individual, your right to work, your right to own property, your right to what happens in your community. All these things are moving through right now. So what do I think the end game is? My connection of the dots looks like provincial control, and where the root of that is coming from, well, there are indications that it's tied to bigger entities, and we're just in process of trying to understand all of that.
So you kind of, my blood pressure shot up when you brought up the issue of immigration because that always angers me. But so I'm going to leave that one alone. Let's go back way at the beginning. You said that you paid for your own nursing to put yourself through nursing school. Is that correct?
Yeah.
How much, if you don't mind me asking, how much
Actually,
about?
I was able to access student loans for my degree program, which, because I worked in an underserved community, a lot of that was forgiven. However, my post-secondary training, specialty training for emergency and wound care, all of that, I bore the cost of that myself.
What are we talking about? $500, 5 grand, 50 grand?
For um, that is really individual. I mean, you have tuition and books, which is standard for everyone. But some people choose not to work during that period and then incur personal living costs associated. I personally worked full time while I went to school full time, so I was doing my best to work as a care aide during the nursing program so that I had skills to actually be able to work efficiently when I started. So that's going to be depending on how people's personal decisions. So if you're looking at personal living costs of what does it cost to live a year, and if you're not working and you're in school, that would be added onto the process.
It's actually not where I was going. I have this theory that we're a nation of victims, and we're a victim of theft. So when you go and you invest whatever your 1 year of your life for $50,000 and you get a nursing license, and the government comes and de facto confiscates your license, that's a theft when they don't let you work. And they did that with doctors, like Mark Trazi is a famous one. There was another one in BC, I forget, the South African gentleman. Do you remember his name? I'm bad with names,
Not
but
Hoff.
they same. Sorry,
Is it Hoff?
Hoff. Yeah, I think it's Hoff. And so they come in through these colleges, which are, as you mentioned, they're basically just an arm of the government. Like they've just been progressively more consolidated, but now this was like the final nail in the coffin. So they can come in and through the legal system, it has the appearance of rule of law. You know, Christopher Hoff or whatever, he spread disinformation. He could have killed people, so we're just going to confiscate his license. Corinne Morey, she didn't get vaccinated. We're going to confiscate her license. And they did this with property too in Vancouver. That famous guy, infamous guy, like he had a party during COVID and they confiscated his apartment. That was like full on civil forfeiture. But like, I see that's happening and I get it. And I think it's fascism, public private partnership and whatever, all those other institutions. But how do the unions fit into this?
Um, I'm also going to just mention in the Emergency Act, one of the new articles is that even if you are trained, qualified, and credentialed in a profession, the government can decide that you cannot practice in that. So that's now part of
What?
the Emergency Act.
What's the difference? They've just formalized what the courts let them do anyway. Like,
Okay, go back to your question. What was that again?
um, okay, so you mentioned the Health Professions Act. That's Bill 36.
Yes.
So, like Matthew Cockle, he's some UBC professor, doctor. He was testifying at the National Citizens Inquiry here in Vancouver, and he was pointing out how it's more sinister than people think. Like they can copy paste legislation from outside of BC, outside of Canada, and he used the conspiracy phrase. I'm not going to repeat it, but the 3-letter institution by that German Bond villain guy. So,
I got it.
so like I get where we're going into fascism. What is it? The unions
Okay,
are just
so
bribed.
before you proceed, I find that most people don't understand what fascism means. So would you just explain that quickly so that
Okay,
everybody has just a basic understanding of that concept?
so it's a good question. I go back to Mussolini. So this guy was a hardcore socialist. Nobody was buying what he was selling. Goes into World War One. He gets radicalized. He comes back. He realizes that the only way to unleash socialism is through force. And he perfectly captured what fascism said is when he said everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. So what's happening here is kind of like that, where the government is basically taking over everything. It might be coordinating with corporations like unions, big tech, But it's basically just it's socialism to me.
Yes, what I see is that um, people who have been responsible and working and creating some kind of asset base are demonized. And sorry, are demonized, and that we are being held responsible for the fact that others who maybe aren't putting in the same effort that we are should have the benefits of that effort, which I see decisions that are occurring are not actually beneficial. So what I see is the government is trying to take over all this development for affordable housing, for instance. And yet the purpose of this is to keep people in perpetual enslavement to a rental system. If the government was really concerned about providing affordable housing, there would be way more rent to own options. There would be, okay, you can start off in this government housing, but a portion of everything that you pay will be set aside for you, that if you are responsible with your payments and you keep your unit maintained, at the end of 2 years, we're going to give you a portion back so that you can enter the housing market in a home ownership capacity. There should be a way that we're encouraging people to actually accumulate assets and protection. And instead, the process is creating enslavement to the government in terms of increasing the amount of government workers so that we have a huge part of the workforce that is dependent on the government. We have increased housing that puts you in perpetual enslavement as a renter. We are creating these systems that do not promote independence, autonomy, and self empowerment. We are creating systems that create enslavement.
Yeah, I agree with you. I keep going back to the national citizens inquiry. Catherine Austin Fitz, she was testifying, and the commissioner asked basically what I asked. He's like, "Is this not the definition of fascism? Public-private partnership, taking over of individual rights?" And she said, "What you said." She goes, "I think it's worse. I think what they're going for is slavery.
Yeah.
So not like whips and chains, but you're completely dependent on the government."
Completely. And they don't have to be held accountable for the actual services that they're providing. So, for instance, in the last 2 years, ever since Adrian Dix has taken the helm of the Ministry of Health and healthcare provision in this province, it has it's like a bomb went off. We all know that the services that we should be getting are decimated, and yet there's no accountability or no avenue for accountability to enforce actual responsible governing of these resources. He also has increased the capacity that civil servants don't have total immunity. They are totally legally protected from any repercussions of the decisions that they make. How did that happen? Like we are. The good thing is that this experience that we all went through in the last couple of years totally has peeled off the illusion of a functional governing system, both at like on all three levels, local, provincial, and federal. And I know that you're interested in the federal level. I've been active in both the local and the provincial, and I see how all of these levels are creating what I call incestuous relationships. They are working with each other in a way that is not what they're legally required to. They're creeping into jurisdictions they have no business being in, and they are causing double taxation for services in both the local and the provincial level, while the actual service level that they're providing is totally inadequate. And it is becoming a pattern. Like, for instance, I had a discussion with the BC Ombudsperson's office over a complaint that I had put in, and I discovered that actually that office has no legal way to enforce anything. They can do an investigation, they can come up with recommendations, but nobody has to do anything that they say. um, Trying to access different government ministers, provincial ministers. There's several that I've tried to interact with. You cannot phone them anymore. You have to submit emails. You might get a response like 3 weeks later. And it's created this whole buffer where the public cannot even access different ministries in this province. We don't even know if anybody's working. It's The system has become so unaccessible to the public that it becomes really, I've had my moments of being overwhelmed. It's like, well, how do we actually create a change in this, change the course, and really, I mean, on a local level, we actually have to show up in person to meetings here at the regional district because, like I said, they refuse to record their votes. They refuse to make the meeting recordings available to the public. So we have to show up in person to find out what's going on. And on the provincial level, I'm just thankful that there's another party that's shown up, the BC Conservative Party, that is actually calling out things like we need to remove the carbon tax. We need to get these, we need to protect your personal autonomy in your healthcare decisions. They're just bringing back the fundamental concepts of what democracy is, because we are no longer functioning as a democratic society.
Yeah. Yeah, it's frustrating, and it's kind of frightening. Um, I was just thinking, you mentioned something. 95% of the contributions you said from the unions go to the BCNDP, and you alluded to rules being ignored. Like, do you know any specific examples of something they did that was illegal, unethical?
Well, I mean, I brought up the example of the amended flu policy that was decided through an arbitration process, including the Ministry of Health, including the health authorities, and including the nurses union. That was just 2019, that no nurse would ever be disciplined for not taking a vaccine or not wearing a mask. And it wasn't even 2 years later that that whole policy was ignored. And that contributed to thousands of nurses not being in the healthcare system right now in this province. They can go across an invisible border to Alberta, and they are, and working there no problem. But in BC, we're refused.
The reason I ask is our mayor in West Vancouver, they're going after him hard. I don't have any proof of this, but I think what he's doing is trying to rein in the chief administrative officer, because he's running around like he runs a show. And now the local media and global news, they're going after him for using campaign funds to purchase a secondhand couch. I don't understand how that's presumably he bought it for his HQ when he was running. Maybe he kept the couch, but they're going after him for that. But like, they're not going after these major violations. So it's almost like they're protecting themselves.
Well, like I say, it's interesting that the BC elections has very strict parameters on contributions, and it's listed there for you to see who gave what and how much. And the rules are that if a contribution comes in past the parameters, it has to be returned, and they're not enforcing it. So how does that happen?
It kind of ties in. We're definitely drifting away from unions, but it feels like the justice system, our courts, are also compromised. I mean, a perfect example would be every one of our charter rights that were violated, and it's almost like the judges came in. They're like, all right, we want to allow these violations to continue. How do we justify them? But I guess my question in this case, if the unions are doing something wrong, who can bring suit against the unions?
The process is, once we finally get through arbitration, we're expecting. I shouldn't speak this out. I mean, maybe Jackie DeGuayo will actually be paying attention and realize that this law firm is not actually providing the evidence that's needed to protect us. I know, who knows. Um, she will have to come up with a decision. If it's against us, we have to appeal it. Once we get that decision, then we go to the labor board. Once we get that decision, we can appeal it, and then we can go to the courts. So we're already, by the time March comes, 2.5 years since terminations. So it's obvious that there is a conspiracy to ensure that we do not get to be able to speak or to have our case brought forward. Now, the advantage is, I believe the BC NDP government is feeling pressure that the average person is recognizing what a poor job they're doing. And there is word that there's going to be an early election in the spring next year. If for some reason we are able to unseat some of those NDP MLAs, we have a better chance of being able to push back on some of these initiatives that are moving through. So, for instance, even the Healthcare Professions Act, I think they want that structure functioning by June. If for some reason we're able to change the dynamics of the provincial government, we may be able to put that on hold or have it revised or make it actually functional and protective of healthcare professionals. So there's an interesting dynamic going on in terms of the parties that are in play at the moment, and the potential that the players could be changed within 6 months, and what that could potentially mean to the course of decisions that are in play now.
How many decades do you think we have to, or how many years do we have to roll back to get back to normalcy?
Um, I don't. I don't think that that's the point. Um, we are in this state of human crises because of, I'm just going to put it bluntly, basically a lack of participation from our own citizens. And I take responsibility for that as well. As I said, most of us are just barely trying to survive, try to get trained for some kind of profession, have a job, and then it doesn't matter how much you work. The costs of living that they're imposing on us make it impossible for anyone to get ahead. I mean, if you have to go to the grocery store and pay $10 for a little thing of blueberries, you'll understand the progression that is going on. It's creating an environment where it doesn't matter how much you earn, it will never be enough. So, and our education system, I know that all the way through, my education as a child up to high school years, and then just recently going through post-secondary, there is never any training on what is government, how does it impact you, what are ways you can participate, even the structure of it, what laws, what protections you have. That isn't provided to the public. And so it's created an environment where people are not informed. They don't understand the process or the systems. They are continually indoctrinated, and I look at this with my experience with university education. Is the process is that you become institutionalized. So you're told how to think, You're told how you need to respond in order to pass, whether you are in agreement with it or not. You move into government funded roles, so healthcare or government positions. And again, you're told how you can think, what you're allowed to say, how to communicate, how to do your job. And I found over and over that it didn't matter how many inputs that were actually beneficial in terms of increasing efficiency or bettering the system. It was enforced over and over that your contribution did not matter. So we have this whole attitude where people have been increasingly told that their input doesn't make change. There's no power in it. There's no point. Just, stay on Netflix and don't pay attention. So we have now created this society because of our lack of involvement in it. And this issue with the pandemic, woke, I don't like using the word woke, but for many of us, our own belief systems and approaches to society as a whole were basically in a coma. And now we're sort of becoming activated again to understand that there is this component of individual rights, but it also has to be in context of personal responsibility and how do we better humanity. And the fact that this can become very uncomfortable to talk about these concepts, to engage in different opinions that can be have a lot of emotional reaction to it, and we have not learned the ability to have civil discussions exploring concepts without massive offense being taken. And so we have to learn those skills in order to come up with effective decision making. And that's really what politics is. It's groups of people coming together and making decisions about what's going to impact their group and how they want their environment to look like. So now we're learning those skills. We have people who are self-motivated in actually putting time and effort into learning what government does, what the jurisdictions are, what the law is, what our rights are. And it is activating us to the point that there's many of us who are doing this for free. None of us are getting paid for this, but we are so committed to trying to restabilize our society and stop it from moving into extinction that we are putting ourselves on the line, on the front lines, to try to bring awareness to this. As you said, this is going to be a process that will be totally dependent on the willingness of people to engage in this. And it's not just a process where you're dealing with external things like government. It also has to work alongside with the internal process where you as an individual have to determine, what do you believe? What do words like justice and integrity and ethics mean to you in practice? What are you willing to do to protect those concepts? And most of us didn't know what was going to be a response from our own persons until we were up against the wall. In my case, when it came to deciding if I wanted to keep my career or deciding to protect the concept of personal autonomy, I was actually pleasantly surprised to discover that what I was willing to value more. And so I walked away from my career and I started walking a path where it became evident that there are many of us who are called to protect our personal beings and try to develop us in a way that we personally have alignment and we are not compromised with our own ethical standard. And as we develop that personally, we are finding others who also are conducting themselves in that manner. And with that team, we are trying to determine what are going to be the best decisions that will benefit our society. So that process is totally dependent on the individual willing to grapple with these personal issues, and then your willingness to Many of us have had to go public in order to find each other. So once you do that, then you find the community that is also working on this. And then we are learning on the fly how we are going to address legal issues, political issues, healthcare issues, and all of these in the context of a group. We are understanding that this is not going to be a consensus agreement. That is really impossible. But in the variety of belief systems and values and opinions, we are going to find a way that we value and respect each other enough that we will find ways where we can negotiate common ground to help each other.
So when are you going to run for public office?
My application is in.
Oh, it is? Cool. Well, I hope you get nominated. And do you know when you'll get a response?
I don't, and my personal journey is I will do everything possible I can to take responsibility to participate. And then it is up to the process to determine my involvement. So I feel like whatever way I go, my purpose will unfold. And it just means that I have to take responsibility to do the next thing in front of me. And as I do that, the path will open. So, however it turns out, I will continue to do what I can to raise awareness, create community, help empower people to feel like they actually have a role in their own lives.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting what you said earlier, that you never thought that we'd end up in a place like this. Like I never thought. I was just a businessman. Like I was running my tech companies. I never thought I'd run for politics. Um, and then when all the nonsense happened, specifically the Emergency Measures Act, I tried to help anywhere I could with the National Citizens Inquiry and any other volunteer groups. I reached out to the Conservative Party. I was like, can I get involved with the EDA? And then finally the PPC let me do it. And I'm exactly the same thing. My ultimate goal is to save this country. This is my adopted land, but it's still my country. And it's like that. Put me in, coach, wherever I can help.
I know. And it's like interesting dynamics in the people that are in this country. So I think historically we have people that have come into this country because they don't want conflict. They're trying to avoid war. They want to come, they want to contribute, they just want to build a peaceful environment. And I mean, like I'm married to a Japanese man, and I had no idea of the oppression that people group experienced during the Second World War until I met him. And I went to school like an hour from where the internment camps happened. And it wasn't even part of my education. I didn't even know about it till I hit my 20s. And there is this historical oppression that our government has done against certain people groups where we are all just trying to create a working society. And I remember when my husband and I got engaged, I actually said to his father, does it bother you that your only son is marrying a white person? Because it was the white people that took all their assets, put them in internment camps, put them into poverty. It was decades of repercussions that they experienced. And it was, 40 years before there was any kind of apology. So I asked him, how do you feel about your only son marrying a white person? And he said to me, it's okay, because the more mixed up everybody gets, the less prejudice there will be. And I thought that was super interesting, just the concept of intermarriage and really removing the component of race because we become intermingled. But it doesn't seem to matter that we create connections between each other. It seems like the government is wanting to always to find ways to divide us. And so if we can't use color, Then let's use things that are invisible, like vaccination status, which has created massive fracturing between relationships. And I find it interesting that we have an escalation of protests about war in other countries, and yet we are not recognizing within our own country the division and hatred that we are contributing to within our own relationships. And at some point, we need to address that and take some accountability for that.
Agreed. um, so I guess we're approaching the end of the show. Is there anything you want to end with? Like maybe is there a way people can help you out? Do you have a donation page because you're not working or anything like that? And
Um, I would say find what interests you and activates you and respond to that. We have people who are engaged at attending board meetings through the regional district, getting on committees with issues that are happening locally. We need people in these meetings to hear what's going on, because that's the only way that we are actually able to identify the mechanisms that the provincial government is using to download authoritarian measures on local government. So if you have an interest in your local communities, get involved with just attending meetings, finding other people within your community that think the same, and start organizing yourselves. It is possible. We have a webpage. It's kootenaitribe.ca. It's just volunteer based, but we are just trying to create a place where people can access videos and information. And then I also have an email list that we use in our local community to bring awareness to people. So there's that level. The provincial level is I would really look at the BC Conservative Party. You can go on their website, which is conservativebc.ca, look at their policies and see if the concepts that they are trying to bring forward are things that you can align with. If you are totally dedicated to your other party, the NDP or the Liberal, at least please make them accountable for what they're doing to us. Because if there isn't some response from the members to their own party, you are contributing to the this oppression that's happening to us. So there's that. And then people like yourself who are moving on to a federal position, if you're putting out videos on information, subscribe to payment so that you can hear what's going on, because the media is not going to tell you. Everything's getting censored. It is up to us to be able to educate and inform all of the public. And so we have to create all those communication networks ourselves to get that information out. So those are a few things you can do.
all right, well, Corrine, thank you very much for agreeing to come on. I had a blast chatting with you.
It is always a pleasure hanging out with you.
All right, Corrine, until the next time, have a nice day.
Okay.
Bye.